In an effort to give his son what he wants most, a millionaire decides to adopt a girl. Among the elegant options, the boy surprises everyone by choosing the cleaning lady's daughter. Torn between shock and acceptance, the millionaire sees his life change when he accepts his son's decision. The afternoon sun streamed through the enormous windows of the penthouse apartment atop the Parkview Tower, one of the most coveted addresses on Park Avenue in New York. From there, you could see the entire city stretching to the horizon, a sea of buildings and movement that never stopped. Edward Sterling stood before that view, his hands in the pockets of his impeccably pressed dress slacks, his gaze lost on some distant point that not even he could identify. He was 42, with black hair just starting to show silver at the temples, an athletic build maintained with discipline in the building's private fitness center, and an expression that always conveyed absolute control. But in that moment, alone in his 3,200-square-foot living room decorated by one of the most renowned architects in the country, Edward felt like the most lost person in the world. It had been a year and a half since Isabella had gone. A year and a half since that silent disease no one expected took away the woman he loved, leaving a void so vast that all the money in the world couldn't fill it. Edward had built an empire in the tech and telecommunications industry, transforming a small consulting firm into one of the largest corporate groups in the country. His fortune was estimated in the billions. His name was always on the lists of the most influential people in America, and doors opened wherever he went. But none of that mattered when he walked into that apartment, and no longer heard Isabella's melodious laughter echoing through the rooms, no longer smelled the French perfume she wore lingering in the air, no longer saw her brown eyes sparkle when she talked about her charity projects. Isabella had been much more than his wife. She was his partner, his confidant, the only person who could get past the armor he had built over years of competing in the business world. The daughter of a traditional New York family with a degree in psychology from Columbia, Isabella could have chosen a life of parties and frivolities, but she preferred to dedicate her time to social outreach projects. She ran a foundation that served underprivileged children, visited shelters, organized fundraising campaigns, and donated not just money, but her time and her heart. Edward had always admired that generosity, that ability she had to see beyond appearances and find beauty where others saw only problems. The sound of small footsteps on the marble hallway floor pulled Edward from his thoughts. He turned his head and saw Liam appear at the living room door, still wearing the uniform of the private school he attended, his backpack slung over one shoulder. The boy had just turned 7, with straight brown hair falling over his forehead, green eyes he had inherited from his mother, and an expression that was always too serious for his age. Since Isabella was gone, Liam seemed to have matured in a way that broke Edward's heart. The boy had cried a lot in the first few months, waking up in the middle of the night calling for his mom, refusing to eat. But over time, the tears were replaced by a silence that worried his father even more. Edward managed to smile when he saw his son, trying to hide the melancholy that had consumed him moments before. Liam was all he had left of Isabella, the most precious thing she had left in this world, and he would do anything to ensure the boy had a happy life. "Hey, champ, how was school today?" Edward asked, walking toward his son and ruffling his hair affectionately. "It was okay," Liam answered in that quiet voice he used lately. "We had math and then PE. I played soccer with Leo and Noah." Edward noticed his son didn't smile when he talked about his friends, like he used to. He nodded, trying to keep the conversation flowing, but he felt a distance between them that he couldn't cross. After losing Isabella, Edward had thrown himself into work as a way to cope with the pain. Endless meetings, trips to close deals, expanding the business into the international market. He knew he was using work as an escape, but he couldn't stop. And in the meantime, Liam was left in the care of Marina, the nanny who had been with them for 5 years, a competent and caring woman who did her best, but who could never replace the warmth of a mother. "How about we do something together tonight?" Edward suggested, loosening the Italian silk tie he was wearing. "We can order that pizza you like, watch a movie, whatever you want." Liam looked at his father with those piercing green eyes, and for a moment Edward had the impression that the boy could see right through him, see all the pain and exhaustion he was trying to hide. The boy dropped his backpack on the beige leather sofa and went to the window, standing next to his father to look at the city below. "Dad, can I ask you a question?" Liam said after a few seconds of silence. "Of course, son. You can ask me anything." The boy hesitated, biting his lower lip like he always did when he was nervous. Edward waited patiently, knowing that forcing the conversation wouldn't help. Liam was like him in that respect. He needed time to organize his thoughts before speaking. "Do you think we could have someone else live here with us?" the boy finally asked, without taking his eyes off the view outside. Edward frowned, confused by the question. "But we have Marina. She lives here in the staff quarters," he answered. "That's not what I mean," Liam shook his head. "I meant like family, like a sister." The word landed on Edward like a weight. A sister. He had never thought about it. After Isabella's passing, the idea of rebuilding a family, of bringing someone new into that space still so marked by her absence, seemed impossible. But looking at his son, seeing that expression of hope mixed with the fear of rejection, Edward felt his heart ache. "Why do you want a sister, Liam?" he asked, crouching down to be at the boy's level. "Because at school, everyone has siblings," Liam explained, finally looking into his father's eyes. "Noah has 2 older sisters. Leo has a little brother. They're always talking about playing together at home, about sharing things, about having someone to talk to, and I'm all alone. When you travel, when you stay late at the office, I'm just with Marina. She's nice, but it's not the same. I wanted to have someone my age, someone to be my friend, to play with me so I don't feel so lonely." His son's words cut through Edward like sharp blades. He hadn't realized how lonely Liam felt. He thought the boy was adjusting well to the new routine, that school and friends were enough. But of course they weren't. A child needed more than that. He needed family, constant presence, someone he could always count on. Edward hugged his son tightly, feeling a mix of guilt and determination growing inside him. He had failed to see what Liam really needed, but now that he knew, he would do everything in his power to give it to him. "Okay, son," Edward whispered. "If that's what you want, then that's what we'll do. We'll find you a sister." Liam pulled back from the hug, his eyes wide. "Really, Dad? You promise?" "I promise," Edward confirmed, feeling a wave of emotion as he saw his son's first genuine smile in months. "We'll figure it out." That night, after Liam went to sleep, Edward stayed up late in his home office, a room paneled in dark wood and lined with shelves full of business books and biographies of great entrepreneurs. He called Eleanor Vance, his personal lawyer and a longtime friend, and explained the situation. Eleanor listened attentively and suggested he start the adoption process. "Edward, you have all the resources for this," she said over the phone. "Stable financial situation, a suitable home, you can offer a first-rate education. The only challenge is that you're a single father, but that's not a deal-breaker. I'll contact the proper agencies and see what we can do." In the following days, Edward immersed himself in a world he knew nothing about. He visited foster homes, spoke with social workers, attended seminars on adoption. Every story he heard, every child he saw waiting for a family, stirred something deep inside him. Isabella would have loved to be there, doing this. She had always talked about adoption, about how there were so many children in need of love and stable homes. Edward had never paid much attention to those conversations, always focused on his business, but now he understood how important it was. However, as the process moved forward, Edward began to feel a growing pressure. He wanted to give Liam a sister, but at the same time, he wanted to ensure the choice was perfect. His business mind, accustomed to calculating risks and predicting outcomes, kicked in. He couldn't just choose any child. He needed someone who would fit their lifestyle, someone who wouldn't cause problems, someone who could easily adapt to this world of luxury and privilege. That's when he had an idea. Instead of following the traditional adoption process, where parents visit shelters and meet the available children, why not do something different? Why not pre-select a group of girls with suitable profiles and let Liam make the final choice? After all, he was the one who needed a sister. He was the one who would live with her every day. It was only fair to give him that responsibility. Edward shared the idea with Eleanor, who initially hesitated. "That's highly unusual, Edward," she said during a lunch at Daniel, one of New York's most elegant restaurants. "The adoption process doesn't exactly work like that. It's not like picking a product from a display case." "I know that, Eleanor," Edward replied, cutting the filet mignon on his plate. "But think about it. Liam is only 7. He needs to feel like he has control over this decision, that he's part of the process. If I just bring a child home without him being involved in the choice, how is he going to feel? I want him to genuinely connect with the girl who will become his sister." Eleanor sighed, acknowledging that the argument made sense even if it was an unorthodox approach. "All right, I'll see what I can do. But you need to understand that the girls available for adoption come from backgrounds very different from yours. Many have suffered trauma, come from broken homes, and need special care. Edward nodded. I understand. That's why I want to do this pre-selection. I want girls who are already in a recovery process, who attend good schools through social programs, who have positive outlooks. Girls who can adapt easily to our lifestyle without major trauma. And so Edward began to assemble his plan. With the help of Eleanor and a team of social workers, he created a detailed profile of what he was looking for. Girls between 6 and 8 years old, with good academic performance, no history of behavioral problems, preferably participants in excellent educational programs. In a few weeks, 5 names were selected. Rebecca was 8 and was the daughter of an American diplomat who had served in London. After her parents' messy divorce and her mother's financial difficulties, the girl ended up in a temporary home, but she maintained excellent grades and spoke fluent French. Isabel was 7 and showed exceptional talent for the arts. She painted impressive pictures, played the piano, and had already participated in a few children's art shows. Her story was marked by the absence of her parents, but she had found a form of expression in art. Brooke was 6.5 and was a little athlete. She practiced Olympic gymnastics in a community project and already had a collection of medals from regional competitions. Her eyes shone when she talked about her training and her dreams of one day representing the United States. Amanda was 7.5 and was an academic prodigy. With an above-average IQ, the girl read complex books, solved advanced math problems, and dreamed of being a scientist. Caroline was 7, was extremely polite, and came from a family that had fallen on hard times after financial problems. She maintained impeccable posture, spoke properly, and knew how to behave in any environment. Edward studied each profile carefully, satisfied with the options. Any of those girls would be an excellent addition to the family. They had potential, education, and prospects for a bright future. Liam would surely be impressed and make a good choice. The meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday afternoon in Edward's own apartment. He made sure to prepare everything down to the smallest detail, just as he did for his most important business meetings. The living room was decorated with arrangements of fresh flowers from a specialty market. A side table offered natural juices, petit fours from a French bakery, and organic fruits. A playlist of soft classical music played at a low volume through the built-in speakers in the walls. Everything had to be perfect. The girls arrived with their temporary guardians in the middle of the afternoon. Edward greeted them with his professional smile, the one he used at charity galas and formal dinners. They were impeccably dressed, in clothes clearly chosen for the occasion. Rebecca wore a navy blue dress with a white sash at the waist, her blonde hair tied in an elegant bun. Isabel was in a floral print dress and a black beret, giving off an artistic vibe. Brooke wore a chic athletic outfit, her hair short and practical. Amanda wore thin-framed glasses and a discreet dress, carrying a book under her arm. Caroline was in a light pink dress, white socks, and patent leather shoes, looking like a porcelain doll. The girls sat side by side on the main sofa, a little tense but well-behaved. Edward spoke briefly with each of them, asking polite questions about their routines, their interests, their aspirations. They answered with the expected politeness, some more shy, others more articulate. Edward was satisfied. The meeting was going exactly as planned. It was then that he called for Liam. The boy emerged from the hallway, wearing a casual but neat outfit, his hair combed. Edward noticed he seemed nervous, his hands clasped in front of him. The father placed a hand on his son's shoulder and introduced the 5 girls, explaining a little about each of them, highlighting their qualities and achievements. Liam looked at each of the girls attentively. Edward expected to see his eyes light up, expected him to ask questions, to show interest. But all he saw was a neutral, almost indifferent expression. The boy looked at Rebecca, at Isabel, at Brooke, at Amanda, at Caroline, but he didn't seem to connect with any of them. "So, champ," Edward asked quietly, "what do you think? Did any of them catch your eye?" Liam didn't answer immediately. He continued to look at the girls for a few more seconds. Then his gaze shifted to the living room door. Edward followed his son's gaze and felt his heart leap when he saw who was standing there. It was Julia, the daughter of Mrs. Rodriguez, the cleaning lady who worked in the building. The girl was 8, with wild curly brown hair falling over her shoulders, dark and expressive eyes and sun-kissed skin. She wore an apron over a faded t-shirt and worn-out shorts. On her feet were scuffed plastic sandals. She was holding a thermal lunch bag, clearly having come to deliver something. Edward felt a mix of irritation and embarrassment. He had specifically requested no interruptions during this meeting. How could Mrs. Rodriguez allow her daughter to show up at this moment? But before he could say anything, before he could politely ask the girl to leave, he heard Liam's voice break the silence. "It's her," the boy said, pointing at Julia. "I want her to be my sister." The silence that followed was absolute. The 5 girls on the sofa looked at Julia with expressions of surprise. The guardians exchanged confused glances. Edward was completely frozen, unable to process what he had just heard. And Julia, standing at the door with her lunch bag, widened her dark eyes, not understanding what was happening. Edward felt the world spin around him. Of all the possibilities he had calculated, of all the scenarios his business mind had foreseen, this one had never crossed his mind. His son, his only son, had just chosen the last person he could have ever imagined. A girl who wasn't in the plans, who wasn't part of the careful selection, who came from a world completely different from theirs. A girl who probably didn't even know the French language that Rebecca spoke, who had never set foot in a gym like Brooke, who had never had access to the books that Amanda devoured. Edward looked at Liam, searching for any sign that this was a joke, a misunderstanding. But the boy's green eyes shone with a determination he hadn't seen in a long time. This was the first time since Isabella's passing that Liam seemed truly alive, truly sure of something, and Edward knew, with a tightness in his chest, that his life had just taken a completely unexpected turn. Time seemed to freeze in that luxurious living room. Edward could feel the blood pulsing in his temples, his heart beating erratically in his chest. He opened his mouth to say something, anything to undo that absurd moment, but the words just wouldn't come. How could he explain to his son that this was impossible? How could he say that the girl standing at the door, with her simple clothes and work apron, couldn't be the sister he so desperately wanted? Julia remained at the entrance to the living room, her wide eyes darting between Liam and Edward. The thermal lunch bag she was holding began to slip from her trembling hands. She didn't understand what was happening. She had only come to bring the lunchbox her mother had forgotten, as Mrs. Rodriguez was on the top floor cleaning the bathrooms in the building's spa, and needed the food for her lunch break. Julia did this all the time, coming up to bring things to her mom during the week after her public school let out. She knew Liam by sight, had seen him a few times in the hallways or the main elevator, always with his nanny, but they had never spoken. They were from different worlds, separated by invisible but absolutely concrete walls. It was Rebecca, the girl in the navy blue dress, who broke the awkward silence. She stood up from the sofa with an expression somewhere between confused and indignant. "Mr. Sterling," she said in her polite but firm voice, "I don't understand. This girl isn't even in the adoption program. Why would your son choose her?" Edward felt his cheeks burn. He glanced at Eleanor, his lawyer, who was sitting in a side chair, and looked just as stunned as he was. The other girls started whispering among themselves, and their guardians exchanged uncomfortable looks. The situation was spiraling completely out of control, turning into a public embarrassment Edward had never imagined he would experience. "Liam," Edward finally managed to speak, his voice coming out harsher than he intended. "Son, this girl isn't here for that. She's Mrs. Rodriguez's daughter. She works in the building. She just came to bring something to her mom. You need to choose one of the girls sitting on the sofa. They're the ones here for you to meet." "But I don't want any of them," Liam replied, and there was a stubbornness in his voice that Edward recognized as being just like his own. "I want Julia. I've already decided." "You don't even know this girl," Edward retorted, feeling his frustration grow. "How can you want someone you've never spoken to, someone you know nothing about?" "I know she's nice," Liam insisted, walking toward Julia. "I always see her here in the building. She's always kind to everyone. One time I was sad waiting for Marina in the elevator, and she smiled at me. It was a real smile, not one of those smiles people give you because they have to, and she always helps her mum. I see her carrying heavy things, cleaning, working. She's strong and brave. She's the one I want as my sister." Edward ran a hand through his hair, feeling completely lost. How had this situation gone so far off the script he had planned? He was a man accustomed to having control over everything, to predicting every move, to calculating every outcome. But here was his 7-year-old son, destroying all his plans with a choice that defied all logic. "Sir, please," a female voice sounded from the door. It was Mrs. Rodriguez, who had appeared upon hearing the commotion. She was a woman in her 40s, with black hair tied in a ponytail, her skin weathered by the sun and hard work, her hands calloused from so much scrubbing and cleaning. She wore the light blue uniform of the building staff and had a look of panic on her face. "I'm sorry, sir, I don't know what Julia did, but she didn't mean to interrupt anything. She just came to bring my food. We'll leave right now. I promise we won't bother you anymore." Mrs. Rodriguez grabbed her daughter's arm, ready to pull her away. But Liam stood between them and Edward, as if protecting Julia. "No, Dad, she didn't do anything wrong. I'm the one who chose her. And you promised you'd get me a sister, that I could choose. I chose Julia." Edward's heart broke at the expression on his son's face. It was a mixture of hope, fear of disappointment, and a determination he didn't know the boy possessed. Since Isabella had passed, Liam had become so quiet, so withdrawn. But there, in that moment, defending this impossible choice, he finally seemed to have come back to life. Edward looked at Julia, really looked at her for the first time. The girl had enormous dark eyes, full of intelligence and sensitivity, even frightened, even clearly uncomfortable with the whole situation. She held her head high, her posture dignified. There was something about her, Edward had to admit, something that commanded attention even in the midst of the chaos. A light, a quiet strength that emanated from her like warmth. The 5 girls on the sofa began to stand up, understanding that the meeting would not have the expected outcome. Their guardians were already on their feet, gathering their bags and belongings. Isabel, the little artist, walked past Edward with tears in her eyes. Brooke, the athlete, kept her face hard, but her fists were clenched. Amanda looked at Julia with an analytical expression, as if trying to understand what she had that the others didn't. Caroline simply lowered her head and followed her guardian in silence. And Rebecca, as she passed through the door, shot one last look at Edward that clearly said how unfair, wrong, and absurd this all was. When everyone had left and the door closed, only Edward, Liam, Julia, Mrs. Rodriguez and Eleanor remained in the living room. The silence was deafening. Edward went to the bar and poured himself a 25-year-old scotch, something he only did in moments of extreme stress. He downed the glass in one go, feeling the liquid burn down his throat, wishing it could also burn away all the confusion in his head. Eleanor approached him, speaking in a low voice. "Edward, we need to talk about this calmly. It's not as simple as you imagined." "I know it's not simple," Edward answered sharply. "Nothing about this situation is simple." Mrs. Rodriguez remained standing at the door, holding Julia against her, as if to protect her daughter from something terrible. The woman had worked in this building for 3 years, always dedicated, punctual, efficient. She cleaned the apartments of New York's wealthiest residents, with the dignity of someone who knew there was no shame in honest work. But now, faced with this surreal situation, she looked like a frightened doe, ready to flee. "Mr. Sterling," Mrs. Rodriguez began, her voice trembling. "I don't know what Liam said, but Julia can't be his sister. We live in a small rented room in the Bronx. We have nothing. Julia goes to public school. She doesn't know how to speak French. She doesn't have all these fancy things these other girls have. You wouldn't want her." Edward looked at the woman and saw something that touched him deeply. It wasn't shame for who she was or where she came from. It was fear that her daughter would suffer, that she would be put in a situation where she didn't belong, where she would be judged and diminished. Mrs. Rodriguez was trying to protect Julia in the same way he was trying to protect Liam, each within their own means and limitations. But it was Liam who answered. "Julia doesn't need to know French or have fancy things to be my sister. She just needs to be herself, and I like her just the way she is." "Son," Edward said, sitting on the sofa and pulling Liam close, "I understand that you like Julia, but you need to understand that bringing someone into our family isn't that simple. There are very big differences between how we live and how they live. Julia would have to change her whole life, leave her home, her school, her friends. But isn't that what happens in adoption anyway?" Liam argued with a logic that surprised Edward. "The kids leave where they are and come live with a new family. Julia would have to do that no matter what family she went to. Why can't it be with us?" Edward looked at Eleanor, seeking support. The lawyer sighed and sat down beside them. "Liam has a point in part," she said. "Adoption always involves significant changes for the child, but in this specific case, there's an additional complexity. Julia is not available for adoption. She has a mother, a family. Mrs. Rodriguez has never put her daughter up for adoption." Julia finally spoke, her voice soft but clear. "It's true. I live with my mom. We don't have a lot of money, but we love each other. I don't want to leave my mum." Edward felt a wave of relief wash over him. There, it was settled. The situation was impossible from the start. He stood up, ready to end the awkward encounter, when Liam started to cry. Not silent tears, but deep sobs that shook his small body. The boy buried his face in the sofa and cried like he hadn't cried since the first days after Isabella's passing. "Liam." Edward knelt beside his son, his heart shattered. "Please, don't cry. We'll find another solution." "But you promised, Dad," Liam sobbed. "You promised I could choose, and I chose Julia. You said you'd do whatever I wanted, that you'd get me a sister." "You lied to me." The words hit Edward like punches. He had never lied to his son. He had always kept every promise he made. But here he was, breaking the first important promise he had made since Isabella was gone. And worse, he was breaking it at the very moment Liam finally seemed to have found something that made him happy again. Edward looked at Julia. The girl was looking at Liam with an expression of compassion that seemed far too old for her age. She gently pulled away from her mother and walked over to where Liam was crying. With a shy hesitation, she touched the boy's shoulder. "Don't cry, Liam," she said softly. "I can't be your real sister because I already have a mom, but I can be your friend. If your dad lets me, I can come play with you sometimes. When my mom is working here in the building, I can come up and we can play together. It's not the same thing, but it's better than nothing, right?" Liam lifted his tear-streaked face and looked at Julia. "Really, you want to be my friend?" "Of course I do," Julia smiled, and it was exactly that genuine smile Liam had mentioned. "So you seem nice, and I get lonely sometimes too because my mum works a lot. We could keep each other company." Edward watched the scene and felt something shift inside his chest. Here were two children, from completely different worlds, finding a simple, pure connection that he, with all his education and resources, had failed to calculate or predict. Julia, though just a child herself, had found a solution that accommodated the impossible reality without destroying Liam's hope. Mrs. Rodriguez looked at her daughter with a mixture of pride and concern. Edward could imagine the thoughts running through her head. Would it be appropriate for Julia to become friends with her employer's son? Would it be fair to expose the girl to a world she could never have? But at the same time, how could she deny her daughter the chance to have a friend, to play, to be a child? Eleanor broke the moment by touching Edward's arm. "Can I speak with you in private?" she said quietly. The two went into Edward's office, closing the door behind them. Eleanor crossed her arms and faced her friend with a serious expression. "Edward, what are you going to do?" "I don't know, Eleanor," Edward admitted, running his hands over his face. "I just wanted to give Liam what he asked for. I just wanted to see him happy again, and look what happened." "Look, I understand your frustration," Eleanor said, "but you need to see what really happened here. Your son made a choice, and it wasn't a frivolous or capricious one. He saw something in Julia that he didn't see in the other girls. And honestly, watching that scene just now, I saw it too." "What do you mean?" Edward asked. "That girl has something special, Edward. The way she handled this whole situation at 8 years old. The maturity, the empathy, the emotional intelligence. She could have gotten scared and run away, but instead she calmed your son, offered an alternative, showed understanding. How many 8-year-olds would do that?" Edward knew Eleanor was right, but that didn't change the reality. "But she's not available for adoption. She has a mother, end of story." Eleanor was silent for a moment, then said, "There are other possibilities, Edward. Have you ever considered a modified private adoption? Or an informal guardianship?" "What are you talking about?" Edward frowned. "Look, I'm not saying it's the ideal solution or that it's legally simple. But if Mrs. Rodriguez agreed, if there was a will on both sides, you could establish an arrangement where Julia spends time here, maybe a few days a week, maintaining the bond with her mother, but also being part of your family. It wouldn't be a formal adoption, but it would be a way to give Liam the companionship he needs and to give Julia opportunities she wouldn't have otherwise." "That's absolutely insane," Edward said, but his mind was already working on the possibilities. "And Mrs. Rodriguez would never agree to that." "Why not ask her?" Eleanor suggested. "At least talk. You don't have to decide anything today. But keep the door open. For your son." Edward returned to the living room where Liam and Julia were now sitting on the floor, Liam showing her some of his toys. Mrs. Rodriguez watched them from a standing position, still tense but with a softer expression, as she saw her daughter interacting. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Edward called. "Can we talk?" The woman nodded, following Edward out to the terrace that overlooked the panoramic view of New York. From there, you could see the city stretching out endlessly, including, somewhere in the distance, the Bronx neighborhood where Julia and her mother lived. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I want to apologize for this whole situation," Edward began. "I never meant to cause any embarrassment for you or Julia. This all got completely out of my control." "You don't need to apologize, sir," Mrs. Rodriguez replied. "You've always been polite to me, always treated me with respect. I know you weren't to blame for what happened." Edward took a deep breath. "Look, I know this is going to sound strange, maybe even inappropriate, but my son has really connected with Julia, and from what I saw, it seems she likes him too. I know adoption is out of the question, and I'm not even suggesting that, but what if there was a way for them to become real friends? For Julia to come here sometimes, play with Liam, maybe even stay for a few days. You would still be her mother, that would never change. But Liam would have the company he so desperately needs, and Julia would have a friend too." Mrs. Rodriguez looked at Edward with teary eyes. "Mr. Sterling, you're a good man. I've always known that. But you live in one world, and I live in another. Julia would get used to all these nice things here, this beautiful apartment, these expensive toys, this easy life. And then when she had to go back to our reality, to our cramped little room, to our difficult life, how would she feel? I don't want my daughter to suffer from knowing what she can't have." "I understand your concern," Edward said, "and I don't have any easy answers. But I can promise that I would do everything to make sure Julia never felt inferior or out of place. She would be treated with the same care and respect that I treat Liam. And maybe, just maybe, this friendship could be good for both of them. Liam needs to understand that there are realities different from his, and Julia deserves to have access to opportunities that could help her in the future." The two stood in silence, watching the city below. Finally, Mrs. Rodriguez spoke. "Let me think about it, sir. Let me talk to Julia. This is very big, very important. I can't decide just like that." "Of course," Edward agreed. "Take all the time you need. But know that my door is open. And regardless of your decision, nothing changes about your job here. You will continue to be respected and valued as you always have been." When Mrs. Rodriguez and Julia finally left, Edward was alone with Liam in the living room. The boy was visibly calmer, but he still had that glimmer of hope in his eyes that broke his father's heart. "Dad, do you think Julia will be able to come play with me?" Liam asked. "I don't know, son," Edward answered honestly. "Her mother needs to think about it. It's a difficult decision, but you tried," Liam said, hugging his father. "You didn't break your promise, you tried." Edward hugged his son tightly, feeling tears burn his eyes. He didn't know if he had done the right thing by proposing that arrangement to Mrs. Rodriguez. He didn't know if he was being a responsible father or just a desperate man trying to make his son happy at any cost. But one thing he knew for sure: his life had changed that afternoon, and there was no going back. 3 days passed since that turbulent afternoon, and Edward couldn't get the situation out of his head. He tried to focus on board meetings, on negotiations with foreign investors, on the strategic decisions his business empire demanded. But his mind always drifted back to Liam, to Julia, to those dark eyes full of dignity, to his son's tight hug saying he hadn't broken his promise. Edward Sterling, the man who commanded thousands of employees and moved millions of dollars daily, was completely lost in a situation involving 2 children and a seemingly simple choice. Liam had returned to that quietness that so worried his father. He went to school, did his homework, ate dinner in silence, and went to bed without complaint. Marina, the nanny, mentioned to Edward that the boy was spending more time in his room, looking out the window, as if waiting for something or someone. Edward knew what his son was waiting for. He was waiting for Julia to show up. He was waiting for that promised friendship to materialize. And every day that passed without an answer from Mrs. Rodriguez was another day of hope, dying in Liam's green eyes. It was on a Thursday, late in the afternoon, that Edward heard the apartment's doorbell. Marina went to answer and returned with a surprised look on her face. "Mr. Sterling, it's Mrs. Rodriguez. She wants to speak with you." Edward's heart leaped. He was in his office, reviewing contracts, still wearing the suit he had worn all day. He asked Marina to bring Mrs. Rodriguez in. The woman entered timidly, wearing her work uniform, her hands clean but marked by daily effort. She wore a serious expression, but there was something different in her eyes, a determination Edward hadn't seen before. "Mr. Sterling, I'm sorry to bother you during your time off," she began. "Please, Mrs. Rodriguez, have a seat." Edward indicated one of the leather armchairs. And it's no bother at all. I was waiting for you." Mrs. Rodriguez sat on the edge of the armchair, her posture rigid like someone unaccustomed to sitting on such expensive furniture. She took a deep breath before speaking. "Sir, I've spent these past few days thinking a lot about what you proposed. I haven't slept well, just turning it all over in my head. I talked to Julia too because I thought she had a right to an opinion, and we've come to a decision." Edward waited, his heart pounding. He realized he was holding his breath. "Julia told me she liked Liam," Mrs. Rodriguez continued. "She said he seems like a good boy even though he's rich. She used those words, even though he's rich, as if it were a flaw, and I laughed because kids have no filter. But then she asked me something that really got to me. She asked, 'Mom, why can't I be his friend just because we're poor? Isn't it right to make friends because of a person's heart, not because of their money?'" Edward felt a lump in his throat. That 8-year-old girl had summed up the entire complexity of the situation in one simple sentence. "And then I thought," Mrs. Rodriguez went on, her eyes beginning to glisten with unshed tears, "I work hard every day, Mr. Sterling. I wake up at 5 in the morning, take 2 buses to get here, clean apartments all day, and get home at 8 at night, dead tired. I do it all to give my daughter the best I can. But no matter how hard I try, I know there are things I'll never be able to give her. A good school, opportunities, an easier future. And now this chance comes along, a little crazy, a little strange, but a chance. Who am I to deny my daughter that just because I'm scared?" "So you accept?" Edward asked, almost unable to believe what he was hearing. "I do, sir, but with a few conditions." Mrs. Rodriguez lifted her chin, showing the strength Julia had inherited from her. "Julia continues to live with me. Our home is humble, but it's ours. She sleeps in our bed, wakes up with me. She's my daughter. You can take her on outings. You can bring her here to play with Liam. You can give her opportunities. But at the end of the day, she comes back to me. And if at any point I feel this is hurting her, that she's suffering or feeling less than because of the difference, we stop. Do you agree?" "I agree completely," Edward said without hesitation. "Mrs. Rodriguez, I promise I will treat Julia just as I treat Liam. She will never be looked down upon in this house, never be treated as inferior. And you have my word that if at any moment you want to change this arrangement, we will. There's one more thing," Mrs. Rodriguez added. "I don't want your money. That's not why I'm accepting. I'll continue to do my job, receive my salary, and that's it. If you want to help Julia with school, with clothes, with those things, then we can talk, but I don't want anyone to think I'm selling my daughter or taking advantage of the situation." Edward nodded, deeply respecting the woman's dignity. "Understood. We'll do everything clearly and respectfully." They shook hands, sealing the unusual agreement. When Mrs. Rodriguez left the office, Edward stood there for a few minutes, processing what had just happened. Then he got up and went to Liam's room. The boy was on his bed, flipping through a comic book without really paying attention. When he saw his father enter, he dropped the magazine. "Liam, I have some news." Edward sat on the bed next to his son. "I spoke with Julia's mum. She agreed. Julia can come here to play with you." Liam's eyes widened, and then for the first time in months he smiled. A huge smile, the kind that lights up an entire face. "Really, Dad? For real?" "For real," Edward confirmed, hugging his son. "She's coming on Saturday for the first time. You guys can play, talk, do whatever you want." That night, Edward heard Liam humming in the shower. A simple, almost imperceptible sound, but one that filled the apartment with a joy that had been absent for far too long. Saturday arrived with a clear blue sky over New York. Edward woke up early, more nervous than he was before major presentations to investors. He supervised as Marina prepared snacks, organized the game room that Liam rarely used, and checked that everything was perfect. Liam was even more anxious, changing his clothes 3 times, arranging and rearranging his toys, asking every 5 minutes what time it was. Julia arrived at noon, brought by Mrs. Rodriguez, who had the day off. The girl wore light wash jeans and a simple yellow t-shirt, her curly hair tied in 2 pigtails with colorful elastics. She carried a small backpack and held her mother's hand tightly. Even though she had agreed to come, it was obvious she was nervous. Liam ran to the door as soon as Marina opened it. "Hi, Julia," he said, his face red with excitement. "You came." "I came," Julia replied with a shy smile. "Your dad really let me." "Of course he did." Liam took her hand. "Come on, I'll show you my room, my toys. I have a ton of cool stuff." Edward watched the 2 children run down the hall and felt a strange emotion tighten his chest. Mrs. Rodriguez stood at the entrance, clearly uncomfortable. "Are you sure everything will be okay, sir?" she asked. "I'm sure," Edward assured her. "They'll play, have a snack, and at 6 o'clock I'll bring Julia back. You can go and relax." After Mrs. Rodriguez left, Edward discreetly went to check on the children. He found them in Liam's room, sitting on the floor surrounded by toys. Liam was showing her his remote control cars, his imported board games, his educational tablets. Julia observed everything with wide eyes, but there was something in her expression that wasn't envy or greed. It was pure curiosity, the fascination of a child discovering new things. "Wow, Liam, you have so many toys," she commented. "Do you play with all of this?" "Not really," Liam admitted with disarming honesty. "Most of them I forget I even have. My dad buys this stuff thinking it'll make me happy, but playing alone is no fun." Julia picked up one of the cars, a sophisticated model with lights and sounds. "It's pretty, but you know what's more fun? Playing anything when you have a friend. Me and my friend Camilla from school, we play make-believe with sticks, pretending they're magic wands, and we have more fun than with any expensive toy." Liam looked at her with interest. "Make-believe? What do you mean?" "It's when you use your imagination," Julia explained. "Like we can pretend this room is a castle, and I'm the princess and you're the knight who has to save me from the dragon." "But there's no dragon here," Liam observed. "That's why it's make-believe, silly," Julia laughed. "We imagine the dragon. Come on, I'll teach you." Edward backed away from the door, smiling. He returned to the living room where Marina was preparing the snack. The nanny looked at him with an expression between surprise and approval. "That girl is smart, Mr. Sterling," she commented, "and she has a good heart. You can tell." The hours passed quickly. Edward worked a little in his office, but every half hour he checked on the children. They played make-believe, then painted in the makeshift art studio Isabella had set up when she was alive, ate their snack, laughing and talking, and watched an animated movie together in the apartment's private theater. And the most impressive thing was how Julia managed to bring Liam out of his shell. The boy talked more, laughed more, and seemed more alive than Edward had seen him in a long time. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. Around 4 in the afternoon, while they were playing in the living room, the doorbell rang. It was Patricia Davenport, one of Isabella's closest friends, who lived in the same building. An elegant woman in her 50s, always impeccably dressed with short blonde hair, the owner of several jewelry stores scattered across New York. She used to visit Edward from time to time, bringing pies she bought at expensive bakeries and offering conversation that he was never sure was genuine friendship or pity. "Edward, darling," Patricia entered without waiting for an invitation, as she always did. "I brought that key lime pie you love and thought I'd stop by. How are you and Liam doing?" Before Edward could answer, Patricia walked into the living room and stopped abruptly when she saw Julia playing with Liam. Her face transformed into a mask of confusion. "Edward, who is this child?" she asked in a low voice, but not low enough for Julia not to hear. "This is Julia," Edward replied, feeling the tension rise. "She's a friend of Liam's." Patricia looked from Julia to Edward, then back to Julia, her eyes assessing the girl's simple clothes, cheap shoes, and hair styled without expensive products. "Isn't she a bit," she searched for the right words, "different from the other children Liam usually plays with?" Edward felt anger rising, but he kept his voice calm. "She's the daughter of Mrs. Rodriguez, the building's cleaning lady. Liam and she have become friends." Patricia's face hardened even more. "Edward, can I speak with you in private?" They went to the office, and as soon as the door closed, Patricia exploded. "Have you lost your mind, Edward? Bringing the cleaning lady's daughter to play with Liam? What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking about making my son happy," Edward answered dryly. "But Edward, don't you see the problem? This girl comes from a completely different world. She probably doesn't have a proper education, doesn't know how to behave in environments like this. And what will people think when they find out? You're one of the most influential men in New York. Your reputation, your name, that matters." "You know what matters, Patricia," Edward said, his voice rising. "What matters is that for the first time since Isabella died, my son is genuinely smiling. He's playing, he's being a kid. And if that bothers you or anyone else, frankly, I don't care." Patricia recoiled, shocked by his harshness. She opened and closed her mouth several times, then said in a softer tone, "Edward, I know you're grieving. We all are. Isabella was special, she was my best friend. But you can't let your pain cloud your judgment. Think about Liam's future. He needs to grow up in the right environment with the right people." "The right people, Patricia," Edward replied bitterly. Like those 5 girls I brought here last week? All impeccable, all with perfect resumes. And you know what happened? Liam didn't connect with any of them, but with Julia, a girl you consider inappropriate, he finally came back to life. So you tell me who are the right people? Patricia realized she wasn't going to get anywhere. She sighed, picked up her purse and headed for the door. I hope you know what you're doing, Edward. For Liam, for you, for Isabella's memory. After she left, Edward stood there, her words echoing in his mind. He knew Patricia wouldn't be the only one to question his decision. New York society was ruthless with those who stepped out of line, who challenged the established norms. He would be judged, talked about, perhaps even ostracized by some circles. But when he returned to the living room and saw Liam and Julia building a tower with blocks, laughing when it collapsed, he knew he had made the right choice. The following weeks established a routine. Julia came to the apartment 2 or 3 times a week, sometimes more when Mrs. Rodriguez had to work overtime. With her mother's permission, Edward enrolled her in a private school near the building, arguing it would be easier for the children to see each other. He also bought Julia appropriate clothes, always taking care to talk with Mrs. Rodriguez beforehand so as not to offend her. The relationship between the two families developed in a way no one expected. Mrs. Rodriguez, initially suspicious and tense, began to relax as she saw that Edward kept his promises. Julia was treated with kindness and respect, never as someone inferior, and Julia, in turn, blossomed. The girl had always been intelligent and sensitive, but now she had access to books, music lessons, and experiences that expanded her world. But the most significant change happened in Liam. The boy who had closed himself off after his mother's death was returning to who he was before. He laughed, played, made plans. And more importantly, he was learning things that no expensive school could teach. Julia showed him that happiness didn't come from expensive toys or luxury apartments. She taught him to value the small things, to be grateful, to see beyond appearances. On a sunny Sunday, Edward decided to take the 2 children and Mrs. Rodriguez for an outing to Central Park. It was a risk, as he would surely be seen by acquaintances, but he no longer cared. They had a picnic on the grass, flew a kite, and rowed a paddle boat on the lake. Mrs. Rodriguez was visibly uncomfortable at first, insisting on treating Edward as her boss, but he gently asked her to just enjoy the day. While the children ran after pigeons, Edward and Mrs. Rodriguez sat on a bench under a tree. "Maria, can I ask you a personal question?" Edward said, using her first name for the first time. "Of course, sir. Please, call me Edward. We're," he hesitated, searching for the right word, "partners in this crazy adventure. No need for formality." Mrs. Rodriguez smiled shyly. "Okay, Edward. I wanted to ask," he continued, "about Julia's father, if it's not too invasive." Mrs. Rodriguez's face clouded for a moment, but then she sighed. "Robert, Julia's father, was a good man. He worked as a bus driver. We were happy, you know, even without much. But he had a heart problem about 5 years ago. He didn't make it. It was quick. He didn't suffer much, thank God." Edward felt his chest tighten. "I'm so sorry." "Don't be. It was hard, very hard. I was left alone with Julia, not really knowing what I was going to do, but we managed. There's always a way, right? And Julia is strong, just like her father. She never complained about anything, always helped me, always been my little partner. She's an incredible girl," Edward said sincerely. "You've done a wonderful job raising her." Mrs. Rodriguez looked at him, her eyes shining. "Thank you, Edward, and thank you for giving her this chance. I know a lot of people must be talking, judging your decision, but you have a good heart. Isabella chose well when she married you." The mention of Isabella brought a lump to Edward's throat. He had thought a lot about how his wife would react to this whole situation, and he was absolutely certain she would approve. Isabella always believed in breaking down barriers, in looking beyond social differences, in doing what your heart told you to do. In that moment, watching Liam and Julia play together, so happy and innocent, Edward realized something fundamental. The choice his son had made, the choice that had seemed so absurd and impossible at first, was turning out to be the best thing that could have happened to all of them. Julia wasn't just a friend to Liam. She was teaching him to be a better person, more human, more connected to the real world beyond the walls of his luxury apartment. And Edward was learning too. He was learning that wealth wasn't about how much money you had in the bank or how many companies you controlled. Wealth was about the human connections you built, about the love you gave and received, about having the courage to make choices that defied what everyone expected of you. When they returned home that afternoon, Edward felt lighter than he had in months. He knew challenges still lay ahead, that society would continue to judge, that there would be obstacles to overcome. But looking at Liam sleeping in the back seat of the car, a smile still on his face even in his sleep, Edward knew he was on the right path. And for the first time since Isabella had gone, he felt at peace. 6 months had passed since that afternoon that changed everything. Fall had arrived in New York, bringing cooler afternoons and a sky that alternated between grey and pale blue. Edward looked out the window of his office on the top floor of the commercial building that housed his company's headquarters, watching the frantic movement on Madison Avenue below. His reflection in the glass showed a man visibly different from the one months ago. The silver strands at his temples had increased, but there was something new in his eyes. A light that had been extinguished for a long time had been rekindled. Liam was unrecognizable. The 7-year-old boy who had been locked within himself was now an outgoing, talkative, energetic child. His grades in school had improved significantly, not because he studied more, but because he was more present, more engaged with life. The school counselor had called weeks ago to comment to Edward on his son's surprising transformation, and when he explained that Liam had made an important new friend, she simply said that this friend was working miracles. And Julia. The girl had become a constant presence in their lives. She spent 4 days a week at the apartment, sometimes sleeping over when Mrs. Rodriguez had to work a night cleaning shift for events in the building. The relationship between the two children had evolved into something that went far beyond friendship. They were confidants, partners in crime, true companions. Liam taught Julia to play chess, and she taught him how to make a kite with newspaper and bamboo sticks. He showed her educational apps on his tablet, and she took him to play at the public playground near her home in the Bronx, where he made friends with children he never would have imagined meeting. But on this particular day, Edward was restless. In his desk drawer, tucked inside a manila envelope, was a letter that had arrived that morning. A letter that would change everything once again. He hadn't opened it yet, but he knew who the sender was and had a good idea of its contents. His hands trembled slightly as he finally tore open the envelope and pulled out the pages inside. It was from Helen Sterling Davis, his older sister. Helen had lived in London for 15 years, married to a British executive, completely immersed in European high society. She and Edward had never been very close, separated not just by geographical distance, but by completely different worldviews. Helen had always been rigid, traditional, obsessed with appearances and social status. She had attended Isabella's funeral, stayed in New York for a week, and then returned to her life in England without a second glance. Edward began to read the letter, and each word was like a small stab. Helen wrote that she had heard through mutual friends about the situation with Julia. She said she was shocked, disappointed and ashamed that her brother was doing something so inappropriate. She used harsh words like irresponsible, unsuitable and disgraceful. She said that Edward was tarnishing the Sterling family name, that he was exposing Liam to improper influences, and that Isabella would be horrified if she were alive to see it. The last sentence of the letter was the one that hurt the most. Helen wrote that she was considering taking legal action to seek custody of Liam, alleging that Edward was not in a suitable emotional state to raise the boy alone, and that his recent decisions proved it. She gave him a 30-day deadline to undo this absurd arrangement with the cleaning lady's daughter, or she would take legal action. Edward crumpled the letter tightly, feeling anger boiling inside him. How dare she? Helen, who barely called to see how her nephew was, who hadn't been a part of their lives for years, now wanted to show up and dictate what was best for Liam. He picked up the phone, almost dialing her number in London to tell her exactly what he thought, but he stopped at the last moment. No, this needed to be handled in person. He would not allow anyone, not even his own sister, to destroy the happiness Liam had finally found. That night, Edward arrived home later than usual. He found Liam and Julia in the living room, doing homework together at the dining table. Marina was preparing dinner in the kitchen, and there was a sense of domestic peace that the apartment hadn't known in a long time. Edward paused at the entrance, just watching the scene. The two children were bent over their notebooks, Julia explaining a math problem to Liam with infinite patience. "Hi, Dad?" Liam looked up and smiled when he saw him. "You're home early today. Look, Julia's helping me with that fraction problem I couldn't solve." "Julia's a good teacher," Edward said, walking in and kissing the top of his son's head. "And how was your day, Julia?" "It was cool," the girl replied, her dark eyes shining. "We had science class today, and the teacher taught us about the solar system. I'd never really learned about the planets before. It's so interesting to know there are such different worlds out there." Edward sat with them, and for a few minutes he just watched the children work. Julia had changed so much in the last few months. She was still the same sensitive and intelligent girl, but now she had a confidence she hadn't possessed before. She spoke articulately, asked complex questions, and showed a voracious curiosity for learning. And the most beautiful part was that she had never lost her essence, her humility, her ability to find joy in simple things. After they finished their homework, Edward asked to speak with Liam alone. They went to the office and Edward sat in the armchair, pulling his son close. "Liam, are you happy?" he asked directly. The boy frowned, confused by the question. "Of course I am, Dad." "Why? Do you miss how things were before Julia was part of our lives?" "No," Liam answered without hesitation. "Before I felt lonely all the time. Now I have Julia. We talk about everything, play together, study together. She's my best friend." "Why are you asking this, Dad? Did something happen?" Edward took a deep breath. "Some people don't understand our situation, Liam. Some people think it's not right for Julia to spend so much time with us, that we're too different." "But we're not that different," Liam protested. "Julia is a person, I'm a person. We like the same things, laugh at the same jokes, get sad about the same things. Why can't people see that?" "I don't know either, son," Edward said, hugging the boy. "But I want you to know one thing. No matter what happens, no matter what people say, I will always fight for your happiness. And if Julia is part of your happiness, then I will do everything to make sure she stays." "You promise, Dad?" Liam asked, and there was fear in his voice. "I promise," Edward said firmly. And this time there were no doubts in his heart. The following week, Helen arrived in New York. She didn't give any advance notice, simply showing up at the apartment on a Wednesday afternoon. Edward was in his office working when Marina called him, saying he had a visitor. When he saw who it was, he felt his stomach clench. Helen Sterling Davis was 52 and looked like an older female version of Edward. Her dark hair was impeccably cut in a short bob, her skin well cared for, her designer clothes probably costing more than Mrs. Rodriguez's monthly salary. She entered the apartment with the posture of someone who owned the place, her critical eyes assessing every detail. "Edward," she said coldly, "did you get my letter?" "I did," he replied in the same tone, "and I didn't like the contents one bit." "I didn't come here to be pleasant, Edward. I came to resolve a situation you created that is getting out of your control." "There is no situation," Edward retorted. "There is only my son being happy for the first time in over a year." "Happy?" Helen let out a humorless laugh. "Edward, don't you see the absurdity of what you're doing? You've brought the maid's daughter into your home. You're treating her as if she were family. This isn't charity, it's insanity. What's going to happen when this girl grows up and realizes she can never have what you have? When she understands that all of this is borrowed, temporary? You're creating expectations you can't fulfill." "Julia knows exactly who she is and where she comes from," Edward said firmly. "No one is lying to her or creating illusions. She has a wonderful mother who raised her with dignity and values. What I'm offering are educational opportunities and friendship for my son. Nothing more." "Nothing more," Helen repeated sarcastically. "Edward, have you thought about what people are saying? Our last name, our reputation, all of that matters. You can't just ignore social conventions because you're feeling guilty for not paying enough attention to Liam after Isabella passed." Helen's words hit Edward like a slap. He took a step forward, his eyes flashing with anger. "Don't you dare," he said in a low, dangerous voice. "Don't you dare use Isabella's name to justify your prejudice. You didn't know her like I did. Isabella spent half her time in shelters, working with children from all backgrounds. She didn't see social differences as insurmountable barriers. She saw people, she saw potential, she saw humanity. And if she were here today, she wouldn't just support what I'm doing, she'd be on the front lines fighting for it." "You're being naive, Edward," Helen insisted, "and you're harming Liam. He needs to grow up in the proper environment, surrounded by the proper people." It was at that moment that a soft voice sounded from behind them. "And who decides who the proper people are?" They both turned to see Julia standing at the entrance to the living room. The girl had arrived with Mrs. Rodriguez minutes earlier and had apparently overheard at least part of the conversation. Her face was calm, but there was a maturity in her eyes that went beyond her 8 years. Helen looked at the girl with an expression between surprise and disdain. "You must be Julia," she said. Yes, ma'am, I am, Julia replied politely. And you must be Liam's aunt. He's told me about you. Oh, has he? Helen crossed her arms. And what did he say? He said you live far away and don't visit much, that you're very different from his dad. Liam was right. Helen opened her mouth to respond, but Julia continued speaking with a calmness that was both impressive and disconcerting. I know you don't like me. You don't have to. I'm not here to please anyone. I'm here because Liam is my friend and because my mom said I could be. But I wanted you to know something. I will never forget where I came from. My mom taught me to be proud of who I am, even if we don't have money. And Edward, I mean Liam's dad, has never made me feel like less than what I am. He treats me with respect, gives me opportunities, but he's never tried to change who I am on the inside. Edward felt his eyes burn. This girl, at only 8 years old, was giving a lesson in dignity and authenticity that many adults take a lifetime to learn. Mrs. Rodriguez appeared behind her daughter, clearly nervous. Julia, don't talk to the lady like that, she gently chided, but there was pride in her voice. No, it's all right, Edward said. Julia is just expressing herself, and she has every right to do so. Helen looked from Edward to Julia, then to Mrs. Rodriguez. Her face went through several expressions: anger, frustration, confusion, and finally something that could be considered reflection. She picked up her purse and walked toward the door, but before leaving, she turned to look at Edward one last time. I'm not going to sue you for custody of Liam, she said in a low voice, but not because I agree with what you're doing. It's because, despite everything, I saw something here today that I didn't expect to see. That girl, she pointed to Julia, has more class and dignity in her little finger than half the people who circulate at our galas. And if this is the result of your decision, then maybe, just maybe, you know what you're doing. And with those words, Helen left, closing the door behind her. The silence that followed was thick and heavy with emotion. Julia began to tremble, finally allowing the fear and tension she had been holding back to surface. Mrs. Rodriguez hugged her, whispering words of comfort. Edward approached them, kneeling to be at Julia's level. You were so brave, he said softly, much braver than I've been in many moments of my life. I just told the truth, Julia said, the tears finally streaming down. I don't want Liam to lose his dad because of me. I can stop coming here if that's better for everyone. No, Edward said firmly, taking the girl's small hands. You are not going to stop coming here. You are part of our lives now, and nothing and no one is going to change that, understand? Julia nodded, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. It was then that Liam came running from his room, where he had apparently been hiding during the entire argument. He hugged Julia tightly. You were awesome, Julia, he said. You stood up to my aunt and defended us. Edward watched the two children embrace and felt a wave of emotion so strong it almost knocked him over. He looked at Mrs. Rodriguez and saw that she was crying too. Their eyes met, and in that wordless moment, they shared a deep understanding. They were both parents trying to do the best for their children in a world that didn't always make it easy. They were both navigating uncharted waters, breaking social rules, defying expectations, but they were doing it together, as allies, as partners in this unlikely journey. That night, after Julia and Mrs. Rodriguez had gone home, Edward tucked Liam into bed. The boy was exhausted from the day's emotions, but there was a peace on his face that Edward hadn't seen in a long time. Dad, Liam said as Edward was about to turn off the light, I understood something today. What did you understand, son? Edward sat on the edge of the bed. I understood that family isn't just the people you're born with. Family is who you choose, who stands by you, who makes you happy. Julia and Mrs. Rodriguez, they're our family now, not by blood, but by heart. Edward felt the tears stream freely down his face. He hugged his son tightly, unable to speak for a few moments. When he finally regained control of his voice, he said, You are absolutely right, Liam, and I have never been prouder of you than I am right now. After Liam fell asleep, Edward went to his own room. There, on the dresser that had belonged to Isabella, was a framed photo of the two of them on their wedding day. Edward picked up the photo and looked at his wife's smiling face. I hope you're proud of me, my love, he whispered. I hope I'm honoring your memory in the right way. And then, as if in response, Edward felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. A deep and true peace that came from knowing he was on the right path, that he was making the right choices, that he was being the father Liam needed, and the man Isabella would have been proud to have loved. The months that followed brought even more profound changes. Edward reduced his workload, delegating more responsibilities to his executive team. He wanted to be more present in Liam's life, to actively participate in the journey they were on. Mrs. Rodriguez accepted Edward's offer to take a vocational course in hotel management, something she had always dreamed of, but never had the opportunity to do. She continued to work in the building, but now she studied 3 nights a week, with Edward paying for the course and ensuring Julia was well cared for on those nights. Julia flourished in ways that surprised everyone. She not only adapted to the new private school but excelled. Her natural intelligence, now fueled with adequate resources and constant encouragement, proved to be exceptional. She had a special talent for science and math, and her teacher was already talking about potential university scholarships in the future. But most importantly, Julia never forgot where she came from. She insisted on continuing to visit her old neighborhood in the Bronx regularly, bringing Liam with her. The two organized a book drive for the community library, with Edward providing logistical support. Julia became a bridge between two worlds, proving that it was possible to belong to both without losing her essence. A year and a half after that first meeting, Edward organized a special dinner. It was a Saturday night, and for the first time he invited Mrs. Rodriguez and Julia not just for a casual visit, but for a formal dinner. He hired a chef to prepare an elaborate meal, decorated the apartment with flowers, and put on soft music. It wasn't a special occasion, no birthday or specific celebration. It was simply an acknowledgement that these two people had become an essential part of their lives. During dinner, Edward raised his wine glass while Liam and Julia raised their juice glasses. "I'd like to make a toast," he said. "Almost 2 years ago, my world fell apart when Isabella passed. I thought I would never feel whole again, that the pain would be permanent. And then something unexpected happened. My son, with the wisdom that only children possess, made a choice that seemed impossible at the time. A choice that challenged everything I thought I knew about family, about society, about what was proper. And that choice," he looked at Julia, "brought back not only Liam's joy but mine as well. So I toast to you, Julia and Maria, for having the courage to accept this crazy arrangement, for having patience with us as we navigated these unknown waters, and for teaching us that family is not defined by blood or social status, but by love, respect, and choice." Mrs. Rodriguez wiped away the tears streaming down her face. "I'd like to say something too," she said, in an emotional voice. "When Liam chose my Julia that day, I was scared. Scared that my daughter would suffer. Scared that she would get lost in this world that wasn't ours. Scared that I wasn't a good enough mother to guide her through it. But you, Edward, showed me that it's possible to respect differences and build bridges at the same time. You never tried to diminish me or make me feel less for being who I am. And most importantly, you allowed Julia to continue being my daughter while also becoming a part of your lives. That is a gift I will never be able to repay." "We don't need to repay anything, Maria," Edward said. "We gained just as much as you did in this story, maybe even more." Liam and Julia, sitting side by side, exchanged a look and smiled. It was the knowing smile of two children who shared a secret, who knew something the adults were still learning. That in the end, what really mattered weren't the differences that separated them, but the humanity that united them. That night, after everyone had gone to sleep, Edward stood alone on the terrace looking at the lights of New York. The city stretched endlessly in every direction, millions of people living their lives, each with their own stories, their own struggles, their own dreams. And he thought about how easy it was to live in a bubble, surrounded only by people just like you, never challenging your own beliefs or prejudices. But he had chosen a different path, not because it was easy or because he was seeking redemption, but because his son had seen something that he himself had been too blind to see. Liam had seen a light in Julia, a strength, a goodness that transcended any superficial difference. And by making that seemingly absurd choice, Liam had not only found the companion he so desperately needed, but had also taught his father the most important lesson of all, that true love, true family, true human connection knew no social or economic barriers. That in the end, we are all just people looking to belong, looking to love and be loved, looking to leave the world a little better than we found it. And Edward knew, looking out at that immense city full of possibilities, that he had found his redemption not in grand gestures or business achievements, but in the simple choice to honor his son's decision, in the courage to defy what everyone expected of him, in the humility to learn from an 8-year-old girl that dignity has no price and that love knows no difference. His life had changed completely on that day, Liam pointed to Julia, and he wouldn't change a single thing about the path they had walked since.